Okay, so get this. You sent over some news about a potential virus outbreak over in China, and it's got kind of this like eerie feeling of deja vu. You know, Human Metapneumovirus, or HMPV, it's making headlines now almost exactly 5 years after the initial COVID-19 outbreak. Crazy timing, right?
Mm.
But here's the thing. There's no vaccine for this one yet. So let's try to unpack this whole HMPV situation, shall we? What do we know so far?
Yeah, definitely raising eyebrows, and for good reason. HMPV, it's a respiratory virus, and a lot like the common cold or the flu. So you're probably going to see familiar symptoms, coughing, fever, maybe some nasal congestion, shortness of breath. But here's the thing that makes it a little bit different from the flu. There's no readily available vaccine. So that adds another layer of complexity to containing a potential outbreak.
Okay, yeah, that's a bit unsettling, especially after, everything we just went through with COVID. So how can someone even tell if they have it? Like if I'm catching a cough and I'm feeling a little feverish, how do I know if it's just a cold or the flu or this HMPV?
Well, that's the tricky part. Clinically, it's really tough to distinguish between these viruses because they often present with, very similar symptoms. So the only way to know for sure is to get lab testing.
So it's kind of like those early days of COVID, when testing was super crucial to understanding how it was spreading.
Exactly. And that's why this rise in HMPV cases in China,
Hmm.
particularly in the northern part of the country, it's causing a lot of concern. I mean, we've all seen how quickly respiratory viruses can spread, especially in those densely populated areas.
Yeah, no, that's true. And, at least the Chinese CDC and their state broadcaster, CCTV, they are actively monitoring the situation now. They're even setting up protocols for unknown pathogens, which is, I guess, somewhat reassuring. But you mentioned there are certain groups that are more vulnerable to HMPV than others. So who should be, like, extra cautious right now?
All right, well, anyone can get HMPV. But it's particularly dangerous for the usual suspects when it comes to respiratory illnesses. Young children, older adults, and people with, weakened immune systems. Also those with pre-existing lung conditions like asthma and COPD, which, by the way, is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which basically makes it harder to breathe. So these groups are at a much higher risk of developing serious complications.
So, kind of like with COVID, protecting the most vulnerable is paramount, for sure. And how is this HMPV spreading? Is it anything like COVID-19? Are we back to, obsessively wiping down groceries again?
You can relax on the groceries for now. It's the transmission routes are really similar to a lot of respiratory viruses, including COVID-19. So think coughing, sneezing, those lovely respiratory droplets we've all become familiar with, close contact with someone who's infected, and touching contaminated surfaces and then touching your face can also spread the virus, although that's thought to be less common.
Okay, so the basic hygiene habits we all learned during the COVID era are still our best bet, hand washing. Covering coughs and sneezes. It sounds like a broken record, but it's a classic for a reason. But this is obviously not just a local issue. What kind of ripples is this causing internationally?
Yeah, globally, a lot of people are keeping a cautious eye on China. Taiwan's CDC, for instance, is closely monitoring the outbreak because they're worried about the potential for it to spread beyond mainland China. What's interesting is that even though we've got this surge in cases in mainland China, a leading epidemiologist in Hong Kong has reported that HMPV levels there are still pretty low. It's kind of a mixed bag right now.
It is. So we've got this virus on the move, and we're all kind of waiting to see what happens next. And this whole thing feels eerily familiar, especially given how China handled information at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, what are your thoughts on their transparency this time around?
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. Remember the initial COVID-19 outbreak?
Hmm?
China received a ton of criticism for its lack of transparency, especially in those early stages. So the question everyone's asking now is, will they be more forthcoming with information this time? It's definitely a key aspect to watch in the coming days and weeks.
For sure. Yeah, and you know how China handles this situation. It could have some pretty significant implications, not just for their own population, but for the global community as well. It raises questions about the responsibility of individual nations to be transparent during potential outbreaks.
Absolutely. It really underscores, how interconnected global health is. What happens in one part of the world can quickly impact everyone else.
Right.
It's kind of like that butterfly effect, only with viruses instead of butterflies.
Precisely. And that brings us to something that's particularly relevant for you. You mentioned a possible connection between HMPV and long COVID. In the sources you sent over, let's dive into that a bit. Yeah, I found that really intriguing. There's been some research hinting that an HMPV infection could actually be a risk factor for developing long COVID.
It does seem a little counterintuitive at first, right? because HMPV is fairly common. And for most people, it's a pretty mild illness. But there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that even these seemingly minor respiratory infections can have long-term consequences for some people.
So even if someone doesn't have like super severe symptoms at first, just having HMPV could increase their chances of developing long COVID later on. That's a little concerning.
That's what some researchers are proposing. Now, it is important to remember that this is still a very new area of study. More research is definitely needed to, definitively confirm this link. But it does highlight this complex relationship between our immune systems and these respiratory viruses. The after effects of what seem like mild infections are kind of a mystery we're only beginning to understand.
It really does add another layer of complexity to this whole thing. Knowing what we do about long COVID now, the potential for long-term health impacts from HMPV is something we should all be paying attention to.
Absolutely. It really underscores the need for more research into long COVID and all of the factors that might contribute to someone developing it. And this potential connection with HMPV just adds another piece to that puzzle.
It's all starting to feel a little bit overwhelming. For our listeners who might be feeling anxious about all of this, what advice can you offer? How can we navigate the situation without spiraling into a panic?
Well, remember, knowledge is power. Staying informed about HMPV and long COVID is really key to making good decisions about your health. And don't hesitate to talk to your doctor about any questions or concerns you have. And always make sure you're relying on reputable sources of information so you don't get caught up in all the misinformation out there.
That's great advice. It is easy to get lost in that sea of information out there. So having those reliable sources you can trust is really important. But, we've learned a lot from our experiences with COVID-19. I think we're better prepared now than we've ever been to handle these emerging health threats.
That's right. Stay calm, stay informed, and stick to those preventative measures we talked about earlier. They can go a long way in protecting your health. We've been through this before.
That is reassuring to hear. Okay, so far we've covered what HMPV is, how it spreads, the current situation over in China, those transparency concerns, and the potential link to long COVID. Before we wrap things up, is there anything else you think is important to mention?
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of step back and look at the bigger picture here. This HMPV outbreak, it's happening against the backdrop of a changing world. We're seeing the effects of climate change, increased global travel, and interconnectedness, and a growing awareness of how human, animal, and environmental health are all linked.
So this isn't just some isolated incident. It's all part of a much bigger pattern that we're seeing emerge.
Exactly. And it highlights the need for a, comprehensive and proactive approach to global health security. We have to prioritize things like prevention, early detection, and rapid response. And maybe most importantly, we need to invest in research and development so we can stay ahead of these emerging threats. Playing catch-up is never a good strategy.
Yeah, it's a real wake-up call. It reminds us that we can't just react to every new outbreak as it pops up. We need to have a more forward-thinking strategy in place.
Exactly. And that requires global collaboration, open communication, and a shared sense of responsibility. We're all in this together.
Powerful message. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Before we sign off, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners? Something for them to think about as they navigate this constantly changing world?
I think it's really about recognizing that, global health security, it's not just the responsibility of governments and institutions.
So you're saying it's on each of us as individuals to kind of step up?
Yeah, precisely. It's about, taking ownership of our own well-being, but also that of our communities.
So like staying informed, practicing good hygiene, making sure we're up to date on our vaccinations, and, being vocal about policies that support public health.
Exactly. All those individual actions, when you multiply them across communities, they can make a real difference. We each have a role to play in building a healthier, more resilient future.
I love that. It's a good reminder that we're not just bystanders in all of this. We're all part of the solution. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here today. We talked about HMPV, how it spreads, the situation unfolding in China, the concerns about transparency, the potential connection to long COVID, and the bigger picture of global health security. What are your takeaways from all this? Is this something we should all be worried about, or is it just a seasonal blip? What lessons can we take from, those early days of COVID-19? It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, for sure. I think while there's no need to panic right now, staying vigilant and, practicing basic hygiene like frequent hand washing, those are always good preventative measures. And as we talked about, knowledge is power. Staying informed and being proactive are really our best tools for navigating these tricky situations.
Couldn't agree more. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. I think we've given everyone a lot to think about when it comes to this HMPV situation and what it could mean going forward. And remember, this is an evolving situation, so new information is coming out all the time. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay well. Until next time, keep diving deep.